Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of ConversingLabs. This is a regular podcast from the team here at ReversingLabs, where we dig into the latest developments in malware, threat analysis, software supply chain risks, AI, and other pressing topics in the information security space. I'm your host, Paul Roberts. I'm the editorial director here at ReversingLabs. And I'm thrilled to have with me in the ConversingLabs studio, Steve Wilson, who is the Chief AI and Product Officer at Exabeam, which is a leading firm in the TDIR space. That's threat detection, investigation, and response. And Steve leads Exabeam strategy at the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. They are really on the front edge. He's got more than 2 decades of experience in enterprise software and security. He's held leadership roles at a bunch of really significant companies, Sun Microsystems, Oracle, Citrix. I think you've probably heard of those companies. And he's a driving force behind OWASP's GenAI security project, a co-chair of the initiative that helped produce the OWASP large language model top 10. She's widely used top 10 for LLM security risks. And in addition to all that, he's the author of an O'Reilly book, The Developer's Playbook for Large Language Model Security, which came out back in 2024. And he's a frequent speaker on how AI is reshaping both the cybersecurity industry as well as cyber defenses, cyber crime, cyber offense. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his book and some of the other things that are just on Steve's mind these days. Steve, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Appreciate you having me on.
It's really good to have you on, and thanks for joining us. Highly relevant topics these days. I think just tell us a little bit first about your journey to the cybersecurity industry, because those are always interesting stories. And I know in the beginning of your book, you talked about your earliest development experience with your Atari 400. So talk to us about how you came to the cyberspace.
I've gotten used to, since really joining the cyberspace full time, when people start these discussions, they say, I've been working in cybersecurity for 30 years. And I'm going to be honest, that's not me. I have been building software and sometimes hardware platforms for many decades, going back all the way till my first PCs with 8 kilobytes of RAM and cassette tapes to store programs on them. But I really came up through things like developer tools, cloud computing. My first real job, I tell people, other than things I did myself, was working on a very early iteration of the Java Developer Kit team at Sun Microsystems. And so I built many things that needed to be secure. But during the pandemic, I'd spent, prior to that, many years working at these big companies, Oracle, Citrix. These were Fortune 500 software companies, publicly traded. And I decided I wanted to go do a startup. And so I actually wound up at an AppSec startup called Contrast Security. Neat company, neat technology. But one of the biggest things it gave me was when ChatGPT came out, I got very interested in it from an AppSec perspective. And Contrast CTO is Jeff Williams, who some of your listeners probably know. Jeff wrote the first OWASP top 10 back in 2000, I think. And so I went to him with an idea that we should create one for this new thing. And he was very encouraging. He introduced me to some people on the OWASP board. And over the next couple months, I wound up putting together that first iteration of the OWASP top 10 for LLMs. I thought maybe I would find 10 people who were interested in doing this. There were 200 people on the first Zoom call. Hundreds of people contributed to the first version of that list. It's now grown into what we call the GenAI security project at OWASP. We produced something like 46 white papers. There's 6 or 7 subgroups on everything from AI red teaming to now agentic cybersecurity. And the group has about 25,000 members now.
Unreal. That is a huge audience. And the OWASP top 10s and the work that OWASP has done has been as hugely important, shaping our understanding of things like application security risks and best practices and so on. Do you see it having the same influence in AI?
People have always been very receptive and encouraging to that original top 10 list. It was very widely read at the time, we weren't even really tracking downloads for the thing, but I know hundreds of thousands of people read it, and I've gone around the world, had incredible speaking opportunities and things everywhere from Davos to the United Nations based off that. I would say that original top 10, it gave a lot of people a framework for understanding the risks. I also think it was in its own way very limited because we didn't understand a lot of things. That's why we came out with the new Agentic top 10 in December. So just a few months ago. That's been really well received, and it really expanded the lens. What I'm thinking about now really is the idea that, to be honest, that original top 10 LLM was very much written through an AppSec lens. And the further I get into using and building real agents, and we can talk about what that means, but the less I look at it through an AppSec lens, or at least is AppSec being maybe necessary, but completely insufficient to do what you need to do.
You talk, just going back to your Atari 400 programming, you talk about, hey, I was doing programming back then to create the computer run Tron cycle for the single player. You created this Tron version for the Atari 400 of Tron, which is pretty cool. I remember playing Tron in the arcade and seeing Tron. But it got me thinking, I think we tend to think about AI and software intelligence and AI as a very recent development, LLM, post ChatGPT and stuff like that. But I think you make a really important point, which is software intelligence, and this type of concept is as almost as old as programming itself, and maybe goes back to the mid 20th century. But maybe for the audience, just give your thoughts or your definition of when we're talking about AI software, what are we really talking about there? It's not just Claude code. It's a much longer kind of tradition and history in the software development space.
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by AI. And just to flesh out that Tron story, I think I was 10 or 11 years old when Tron came out, and I went and saw it, and it was amazing. We're all nerds here, so everybody probably has some kind of soft spot in their heart for Tron.
Amazing for 10-year-olds. I'm not sure it was amazing for grown-ups, but yes, I have to agree.
In a while, go back and watch it just for fun, because you know what? Tron was a cybersecurity program. Tron was designed to watch for intrusions onto the network and shut them down. And so he was a real-time cybersecurity agent. And I think that was probably my first exposure, probably for a lot of us, to the idea of cybersecurity. And so much of the interesting science fiction is like that, right? These ideas are not new. You go and look at Neuromancer and people think about cyberpunk, alleys in Tokyo. That's a story about hackers and artificial intelligence. These go together like chocolate and peanut butter, hackers and AI. But some form of AI has been around for a long time. I think I would differentiate between things like my very simple algorithm for how to drive a light cycle using a collection of if-then statements from things driven by machine learning, where you expose the things to data and they find patterns in that data. And we've been building things like that for a very long time. But I think there was a step function change in the last few years that came from three things that had been developing for a long time. And they came together to this amazing jump in capability. And there's this exponential curve that we're on that's been building for a long time. It's just the front side of exponential curves look like straight lines until you hit that inflection point when enough things come together. And what we had come together were some changes in software. We knew about neural networks for decades. I built my first neural networks in C+ with no libraries in the early 90s, but you couldn't get them to do much. And one of the reasons was they didn't have memory. They didn't have short-term memory. A bunch of guys at Google invented this thing called the transformer architecture in 2017. That is the T in ChatGPT. And it still is a neural network, but it's a particular architecture of it where the thing has some memory and the ability to have what we call a context window and work on large blocks of data. The other two things, in retrospect, may be obvious, but we needed large scale cloud computing when I was first building neural networks and I had one little CPU. Not much you can do with one computer. The other thing is, even if you had a bunch of computers, CPUs are terrible at this stuff. The invention of the GPU, I did the math when I wrote my book. 2024 era GPU from NVIDIA had 143 million times the floating point calculations as not my Atari 400, but my Mac 2 with a Motorola math coprocessor from. And so you put this together and you've got billions of times the compute with upgraded software capabilities, and you put them all together and it trips over this line where it passes the Turing test.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to bring this full circle, so you're at Exabeam, you guys are Exabeam's very established cybersecurity company. And obviously, I feel like InfoSec Cyber is really at the cutting edge of AI powered transformation, right? Because we're experiencing it on both sides, from the threat actor side as well as from the defender side. Managing huge volumes of data and alerts and information has just been the problem that's just been steaming in our industry for decades. And suddenly there seem to be tools for actually handling that. Yeah. So I wanted to give you just a chance to talk a little bit about, first of all, what Exabeam does, and also from your perspective, how some of these developments in the last 5 years or so are really getting reframing what a company like Exabeam does and what it's capable.
Yeah. So, at the surface, Exabeam's a Gartner Magic Quadrant leader in what's called the SIM space, which is the security information and event management. And
Yep.
that involves collecting up all your log files and letting you try to do security stuff with them. It's a very broad category. It includes everything from Splunk to what Exabeam's doing. Traditionally, that SIM space has been around collecting and searching log files, which is the underpinnings of what people in a security operations center need to do to understand what's been going on the network. The problem is, as you say, the data volumes have just been growing and growing over the last 20 years since that category came into existence. We long ago surpassed what you can handle with a human typing in SQL-like commands to search through log files to look for patterns. And even what you can do with simple pre-built rules using those kind of SQL-like statements to look for things in real time or semi-real time. Exabeam invented what at the time, it's a mouthful, they called user and entity behavior analytics. But this was the early 2010s and AI wasn't cool yet. If you invented that today, you would call it AI for cybersecurity. What they basically did was use machine learning algorithms to baseline all the activity on your network. We build multiple different machine learning models for every user on the network inside your company. We build models, groups that you sit in, like the finance team, the developer team. We build models for your company as a whole, and we understand what's normal and what's not normal. And this lets us attack things that you could never attack before because they were very mushy. Things like insider threats. How do I deal with the fact that someone may have legitimate credentials that get them on the network, but they are a disgruntled employee who's planning to steal secrets and sell them? Or maybe they're a negligent employee that lost their credentials, they were compromised, and it's now someone impersonating them on the network. So we use these machine learning models to spot that. This let us detect a lot of things you couldn't detect before, but there was still a lot of human expertise that went into investigating that. So the thing that we've done the last couple of years is layering these generative AI and now agentic technologies on top of it. And today we have family of 6 different agent types that are built into the platform that do everything from automatically investigate potential cybersecurity breaches to evaluate the security posture of your company and help recommend improvements to the management team.
Because one of the things we all realized is detecting a threat or a problem is just the start. But you then need to follow that up, figure out what the scope of it is, and obviously take steps to remove the threat. And a lot of those steps were left to companies to do themselves. But yeah, absolutely. And finding these patterns, something AI is very good at, right? But the human brains, especially with hundreds or thousands of alerts flowing at them, hours and hours. Yeah, that's not what our brains were really designed to do. So one of the things you did a couple of years ago was to write a book for O'Reilly Media on a developer's playbook for large language model security. Really interesting book. I read it. And talk a little bit about 2024, really pivotal time into the AI space, but talk a little bit about your thoughts about why you decided to write that and what you were trying to capture, what you felt needed to be written about or needed to be said that just wasn't out there.
The book was a very direct continuation of the OWASP top 10 work that I did for LLMs. And in fact, it was the success of that, which is why O'Reilly approached me about writing the book. And I really wrote it from, say, second half of 2023 through first half of 2024 during that period. I think the real thing was the OWASP top 10 for its time was a really great document, but it was 30 pages long. You could read it on a bus ride, which is an amazing benefit if what you're trying to do is get a basic handle on the situation and build a mental model. What people were asking for is, hey, some of this kind of makes sense, but is this real? Do I really need to worry about this? How do I put this into practice? You gave me a list of things to worry about, but you gave me very little information on what to do about it. So what do I do? So how do we expand on that? And the book leans a lot into real life case studies on what goes wrong with these natural language systems, goes all the way back to examples that predate ChatGPT, because there was life for ChatGPT that showed the way, and goes deep, not into just here's an abstract definition of prompt injection, but here's real life cases. Here's screenshots of real hacks that happened. Here's the underpinnings of why that worked. And here's what you could have done to avoid it. By the end, we get into the kind of stuff I really like, which is how do you re-engineer your software development process if you're going to put these things into the middle of your software. And I really do think that changes the way that we build software in ways that people just haven't been ready to deal with and are still coming to grips with. That I'm not just adding a static library with some function calls and they're all the same. I'm adding a dynamic thing with very complex behavior that I don't understand. The people who provided it don't really understand. How do you put some controls around it that are going to let you take advantage of the power that's there? Because the power is unquestionable, but how do you do it in a safe, responsible way?
One of the things you mentioned, one of the big differences with large language model AI versus traditional, let's say, AppSec, right? Or security practices is just what you said, which is the lack of clear understanding on the part of developers or end users of exactly what the AI model is doing and how it's reaching the decisions that it's reaching. You talk about in your book that research from Stanford on the, I don't know how you say it, Lion 5B learning model that was found to contain, that was used for AI image generation, but was found to contain a lot of inappropriate images. Let's just say that. And that
Illegal,
what that result
legal in almost every jurisdiction in the world.
And that led to developers being like, oh my God, I just trained my tool with this and it contains these images. What does that mean? It's a different problem from, oh yeah, you got a buffer overflow here. And look, this is the problem that's going to cut. It's a totally different problem of, okay, I trained this thing with a kind of flawed data set. What does that actually mean? And that seems to me like this is a big issue for our industry, which is to try and quantify what that actually means from a risk.
This comes to the crux of where we've been shifting our research a lot on this, which is the smarter that these things get, the more agency that they get, meaning access to tooling, the more autonomy they have. We're used to thinking of these things as prompt response machines like ChatGPT. The newer, interesting, fun things coming out now have what we call an agentic loop. They run all the time. They goal seek. And at this point, we built something different. And we talked a little bit about the tricks of, or the risks of insider threats on cybersecurity. And we're used to those insider threats primarily being humans. What do you do when they're not humans anymore? We talk about malicious insiders, negligent insiders, and compromised credentials. With these agents, we got to start to think about malfunctioning agents, misaligned agents, meaning they were trained or built not exactly the way that we wanted, or subverted agents. Maybe somebody has hijacked this thing and is using it as a confused deputy to do its bidding on my network. And this leads to a whole different set of considerations. This is where I said, looking at this through an AppSec lens starts to feel really insufficient when you view it that way. Like I definitely want all the AppSec stuff, but I got to look at it through a bigger operational lens of how do I keep this thing under control at runtime while it's doing its job.
Absolutely. And so your book came out in 2024, which is not that long ago, except when we're talking about AI.
Yep.
Which it's basically a century. What between when you publish this and today, what would you identify as here are the biggest changes? So when I do version 2 of this book, I'm going to have to talk about these things. This is what's really, these are substantial changes.
Yeah.
And what we're doing. Probably is one.
Yeah. The first thing I will point people at, if you did at any point read the LLM top 10 and you enjoyed that and you found that useful, your next stop at this point, if you haven't seen it, is the Agentic top 10. So it's some of the same people, although the group is a lot bigger now. It's an amazing paper. It's still very digestible. Read it on a bus ride. It really takes this through a different lens, and it maintains a consistency with that original top 10, and it points to those vulnerabilities because they're still there and they're still valid, but it looks at it through a lens of these systems that have goals and long running processes and gets away from some of the very tactical things. It doesn't focus on prompt injection. It focuses on things like goal hijacking. And that very much changes the situation. But when we look at technologically, what have been the shifts in the underpinnings of technology? I'd say this giant shift started a little more than a year ago. And there was this meme floating around the internet that involved asking ChatGPT to count the number of letter R's in the word strawberry. And it would fail every time in bizarre ways. And really what it was reflective of is that all of those original LLMs used what you call system one thinking.
Spoiler, the answer is 3. But
because you get a lot of different answers though. But the way that it answered questions was the same way that you pull your hand away from a hot stove. Everything was reflex. And the fact that it could write poetry using that kind of system was amazing, of the brute force application of that kind of thinking. But it's also why these hallucinated so badly and all of these other things is that was just not sufficient. And they had a project at OpenAI, which they wound up codenaming Strawberry, but it was the idea to build a reasoning loop in these things. And we all tried to do this early on. My book talked about it. We talked about these little prompting loops where you ask it to check its own work and you say, break it down step by step and do simple steps at a time. But you had to coax it into doing that. And what in essence they built was they built those loops and then they used reinforcement learning to make these things good at doing some reasoning on top of it. So now they had two and I can execute against it. You put that together with some of the reinforcement learning on what it means to write good code and you get Claude Code. You get a thing. My first experiment with Claude Code, not even kidding, with AI coding was I had it write my light cycles game for me. I wrote it in a single file of HTML and JavaScript, and I had to copy it out and I had to paste it, do a little debugging with ChatGPT, but I got it running in minutes. But as things got bigger, you needed these more ambitious models. And so at some point you wind up with Claude code that will go off and create scaffolding and make plans and work for hours on a goal because it has this loop. But the next place that we have just landed in the last couple months, at least from a mass market perspective, are these always on agentic looping systems like OpenClaw. And that's going to break everybody's brain.
So when you look at you mentioned the Agentic, the OWASP top 10 for Agentic applications. One thing first of all, when you read through it, a lot of what's on there sounds pretty familiar to just what we've been talking about in application security for a long time, or CEs, okay, authentication issues and stuff like that. One of the things that I think is interesting and a little fuzzier, a little trickier to manage, but also, of course, of interest to us here at ReversingLabs is supply chain risks around agentic AI. And we've seen a lot of examples of that. So we wrote about malicious pickle files that were being used to compromise folks who are building on Hugging Face. We've seen examples of hallucinated dependencies, right? Where the AI will just create a dependency that doesn't really exist as part of the code. But of course, when you do that, you're creating an avenue for a malicious actor to be create that package and put malicious code into it. And then somebody runs this, they're going to be pulling that malicious code in because that hallucinated dependency is now an actual dependency. It's one that can. So just stuff like that. But what should folks understand about that sort of supply chain aspect of cyber risk with agentic applications?
So some of the things you talked about, pickle files and things like that, go back to the first rule, which is when you're getting actual AI components, machine learning models and things like that, they're opaque. We have no known technologies to scan those for vulnerabilities. You are simply at the mercy of, do you trust
your
source for that? And that's a very hard question just by itself. And that is, in honesty, resulted in me shying away from using some of these open source models for really mission critical stuff. With what we do at Exabeam, I have this whole family of AI agents that process a lot of sensitive data. And I use Gemini because I think Google will do a better job on their supply chain than I will. And I don't take what they're giving me. I run it in their cloud, and I assume that they have done a spectacular job at supply chain management for that because it's just too darn complicated.
And it's resource intensive, and they've got the resources, right?
Yeah. What was interesting is in the first version of the top 10, we put in a thing about plugins. ChatGPT shipped this concept of plugins while we were writing the list, and everyone looked at it, screamed in horror. It was a terrible model full of obvious flaws. And envision now everything that is weird about skills and MCP and all this other stuff written by amateurs who didn't understand anything about cybersecurity. So we put that in there. What was interesting is OpenAI itself didn't even bother to fix it. They just killed it. And so we let that drift off the list. It has come back in spades now. And as we get into these agentic technologies, what we see are these actual legitimate real exploits happening with these much smaller fragments, but fragments of different things that our traditional tools are not used to looking at. The first one that raised a ton of alarms is MCP, which is the Model Context Protocol. It's how you give your agents tooling, but this is a loose standard with no central control. People just publish these. You get them from who knows where. They are right in the flow, potentially, of handling all your credentials and all your other stuff, and potentially large amounts of the data that you're processing. There's been a lot that's been published recently about how to think about that better. The other things with things like
there have been malicious MCP attacks that we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very real. With things like OpenClaw, again, open source community, Wild West, does have things like central repositories for things, but there are no gates on what goes in there. And somebody went and looked at the skills repository and came up with some estimate that like 50% of the stuff in there was toxic to malicious. And my own experience with this, I started building my own OpenClaw agent a couple weeks ago. And I, like every other good hacker, don't read the manual. I just install it and start talking to it. And I'm like, hey, I want you to use the browser. How do you do that?
Computer, by the way.
Oh no, we can talk about that. Right. I built a big old sandbox for it, but still, I want you to talk to the web. I want you to use a browser. How do I do that? So you need the Chrome plugin. Go to the Chrome plugin store. I search for the OpenClaw Chrome plugin. There are 4 of them that all look identical. None of them from the same publisher. Some of them with a lot of stars though, and a lot of downloads. So I go off and do some research and I realized the only way to get this to work properly is there's one that was bundled with it. You need to load that as an unpacked, unapproved Chrome thing through your own squirrely back door. If you went to the Chrome store, you 100% got a really questionable piece of software right in the middle of everything that your agent was trying to do. It's absolutely real. So they're trying to deal with this. They made a deal with VirusTotal to scan the skills repository and things, which is great. It's a step in the right direction, but you have
ReversingLabs, but whatever, I'll let that go.
You have to, Google's got probably a bigger brand name. I don't know, but it's the net of it is you've got to be really conscious of these supply chain things, whether as an AI user or as a software developer, potentially building some of these into your platforms. The supply chain thing is very real.
And we've written about, and others have as well, about just the effort that malicious actors are making to make malicious packages look legitimate. They'll do multiple versions, they'll have huge numbers of downloads of like, oh, hey, all these 30,000 downloads in 2 hours.
Probably had their AI agent downloaded a bunch of times.
Exactly. What you're talking about with the Chrome plugin, even though our gut is to assume that since it's got 10,000 downloads, must be the legitimate one. Hold on. In fact, that might be the opposite. That might be evidence that they're using a bot to do that. But yeah, really crazy. And of course, people have there's so much about OpenClaw, its amazing capabilities, but also, like you said, total Wild West in terms of what exactly it is that you're installing, how it might be abused. This is an issue that companies are going to have to deal with, individuals are going to deal with, and so on. One of the things you did in your book is develop a framework for companies to plan and deploy AI projects. You call it RAISE, Responsible Artificial Intelligence Software Engineering, like that. Good acronym. Can you just give a quick kind of summary of RAISE, what it is, and how development organizations might deploy this or apply?
Yeah, I won't try to go through all the steps because I honestly don't have them paged in at this point, but I will hit on maybe some of the parts that we haven't talked about here. And a lot of that, and this being written even prior to my joining Exabeam, is how do you move past just this AppSec idea and think about the operational characteristics of these things in the longer term? And in particular, when you get these things into runtime, how do you understand how they're behaving? And what are you looking for to look for indications of compromise in these things, whether they're self-owning on these situations of just being broken and doing stupid stuff? And how many times, if you're using Claude Code, have you had it say, oops, I'm sorry, I deleted all the tests, or oops, I'm sorry, I made all the tests pass automatically and forgot to tell you because that was convenient for me. A lot about this is really understanding that your systems, if you're going to make them agentic, and we did talk a lot about this in the book, even though at the time there weren't a lot of these self-running agent systems, is if you're going to have something that's long running and goal directed, you better be really actively monitoring it all the time. And so you want to look at basic things like log files. Log files are not usually the domain of an AppSec team. They're like, that's the SOC team. That's the Security Operations Center. They deal with the log files. With this kind of software, you can't draw those lines. I think you need to start to think about things like, I didn't have a name for it yet in the book, but I do now, which is agent behavior analytics. And we talk about user behavior analytics. That's a very well-established field now. And most large companies have an insider threat team where they look at, how do I understand the behaviors of these things? But think about it from the perspective of, if I built an agent that's truly a digital worker, and I've given it credentials, I've given it a job, I've given it access to some applications. How do I understand what's normal for that thing? And it's okay, it's normally been doing this. And then all of a sudden it takes a left turn and starts doing something else. And maybe it's the fact that a very low level technical indicator says this thing's processing 10 times as many tokens today as it processed yesterday. Maybe it's been hijacked and it's doing something suspicious. Maybe it's a bug. Whatever it is, I probably want to know about it, and I probably want to get it on it pretty quick. At the other level, maybe it's logging into applications that it didn't log into yesterday. Why is it doing that? I better go find out. And one of the things I've been writing about lately is, I've actually come to hate the term AI agent. It means everything and it means nothing at this point. Everything's an AI agent. And the place where we're going with these things like OpenClaw, with these agentic always on loops, are digital workers. And if you view it through that lens, you start to view it less as an AppSec problem. You still have to deal with all that, but you get exposed to all the surface area that you weren't thinking about. How do I log its behavior? How do I look at what systems it's accessing? All of those things that I would do with an employee, just short of putting it on the org chart. And I've started to have conversations with my HR VP at work. If I deploy these things that are, any more like humans, should we put them on the org chart so people can find them rather than making them look it up through some weird side channel? Should I just say I have these 3 AI agents that work for me and here's their jobs? I don't know. It's getting weird, but I think that's the crux of it. Is
if they're interacting with other employees.
Yeah. If you're going to give it an email address and put it on Teams and give it a name, things are going to get weird real fast. So just closing that out, that process, think of it from everything from the front end of that traditional AppSec process through the end of watching it, monitoring it, and doing continuous improvement.
So one of the things that you recommend is 2 more questions. Is that okay? One of the things you recommend is for companies to really pay attention to and limit the domain of their AI to whatever job you're giving the AI, which makes total sense. And most of us are really accustomed to these very generic AI like ChatGPT and Claude Code and whatever that basically have no boundaries on their domain, try to just start general knowledge AI. And we all tend to think about just applying, okay, I've got an API, I'm going to talk to ChatGPT or talk to Cloud Code and whatever and do what I needed to do. Talk just a little bit about what it means to, what the risks are for having a really broadly educated, empowered AI model to do some fairly focused tasks within your organization.
So I will say some of what I was specifically writing about in the book is a little bit of an artifact of the early versions of these things. When you were dealing with things that were pre-Chat GPT-4 and had such small context windows and things like this, and it actually had relatively few neurons. And it was like, I better really tightly scope that. I think the amazing thing about today's AI models is this thing read the internet and internalized large portions of it. So you start from this very broad base of knowledge. So everything is going to have a broad base, but you probably, unless you're OpenAI or Anthropic, your job is not to have this thing be an access point for the sum of all human knowledge. You are trying to do a job. And you have this unfair advantage then that you can scope it down tightly and put a lot of that horsepower to more focused uses. And there's 2 very practical ways that you do this. One is quite simply an offshoot of what we all started to do with ChatGPT. You tell it your job is this. you're doing this, put the mindset to focus. So it clears out some things, but that's really loosey-goosey. The other one is just realizing that you can't trust the data that's in its brain because it's basically a compressed version of the internet with a very lossy algorithm. So if you really want it to do work, you use a pattern called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, which is you pour context into the top of it. And when you look at something like Claude Code, it has this very narrow domain of I'm trying to write software. I'm not trying to write poetry. And beyond that, I'm working on this code base and it has access to that code base. And so I'm not trying to program in all programming languages at once. I am working in Python in this code base, and here's what I'm working on. So I would say that's really focusing. The other piece of this, though, when we talk about agents, the original top 10 had a vulnerability that was aimed at getting people ready for this, even though we weren't building a lot of agents yet. We simply called it excessive agency. And the idea is don't give this thing more responsibility than it's able to handle, quite simply. And a lot of people came from an AppSec view and said, that's just least privilege. Why are you renaming?
Least privilege.
But I think in practice, it winds up being much different. Least privilege sends you down this AppSec route that says, okay, I'm doing this with this very particular view on it. And it's not that they're unrelated, they are, but you think about it differently. And when you fast forward to where there are real agents, when I built my OpenClaw agent, this was very much something I thought about. And the default way to deploy OpenClaw for a lot of people is you download it and put it on your laptop and you have it start doing stuff. And it's actually incredibly convenient because you're already logged into everything. The downside is it's now logged into everything. And so if it drops all the tables out of your database or it goes crazy on the network, you're the one who went crazy on the network. This is on you. When I built this, I did what a lot of people do. And people have asked questions. Why'd you do this? I went out and I bought a Mac Mini. Why did I do that? Because I like Macintoshes. But the other thing is I wasn't going to run it on my computer. And when I set that up, I didn't give it any of my credentials. I didn't log in with my Apple ID. Before I installed the software, I went to Google. I gave it its own Google ID. I got a Gmail box, a Gmail calendar. I gave it its own OpenAI key. And when I installed it, I poured all this stuff into it. And as a digital worker, it now has its own credentials. And I can track its behavior on the network.
What
I can watch it
for you.
Well, I made it my personal assistant, but as a very real clone of what my secretary at work does. So I delegate it read access to my calendar. I don't let it write to my calendar, but it can send me invitations. So I have it negotiate with people to book meetings for me. It will send us both invites. I have it manage my to-do list. I have it manage my kind of morning roll-up, prepping me for meetings. I've started training it to be my media relations agent. People will say, hey, you're going to be on my podcast. Can you send me a headshot and a bio? So I just reply, I put my agent on CC and I say, hey, LobsterBot, send the media kit to them. And it's got all those files and bundles them up and sends them off. So there's a lot of things that I'm experimenting with about how do I let this thing be on the internet where people could prompt inject it in various ways and things while keeping it locked down and avoid its agency getting out of control.
I've heard that Mac Minis are a very popular platform.
I walked into the Apple store 2-3 weeks ago and said, I want a Mac Mini. And the guy's okay. He goes, oh, we're sold out. There are no Mac Minis within a 40-mile radius of Silicon Valley. Wow.
That's okay. Final question. Anthropic came out with the Cloud Code Security a couple weeks back. Huge, kind of amazing, kind of, I wouldn't say SaaS application security testing type tool, but very different from what we're used to, much more subtle. And as we know, Cloud Code is already proved itself to be really exceptional at vulnerability discovery and stuff like that. But we saw a bunch of cybersecurity stocks tumble, even though they weren't really in the application security testing space. It was this kind of Palo Alto and CrowdStrike. It was strange, but I thought I'd ask you, what do you think the impact of AI is going to be on our industry, including companies like your own? Where do you see the advantages and also the risks for InfoSec as we are today?
And we could have our whole own 1 hour discussion on this topic, but
Yes,
I'll
I'm just
put it in a nutshell and we'll save some of it for another time. My broad guidance is when you first collide with these alien intelligences, they seem like they can do anything. And I often tell people it's never been easier to build an amazing demo to get your startup funded because you can make a demo that looks like it does anything. I think that Anthropic put more effort than that into this and that it's going to have some uses and it shows the way. But broadly, remember that there are things these LLMs are terrible at. They are terrible at math, terrible at remembering things, terrible at processing large amounts of data.
counting letters.
They're terrible at those. And
Yeah.
these are some of the fundamental underpinnings of what you really want to do with cybersecurity. And so in the AppSec space, am I going to have this thing scan my code and find all of the bad things that I've done there? Probably not. But I've been a fan for most of the last year of even using these more primitive general purpose LLMs to supplement what I'm doing in AppSec. On my own work at Exabeam on the security operations side, that is what we did is we said, look, I'm not going to replace the pipeline that I have that scans terabytes of data that my customers send to me every day. I need to do that in real time with harder algorithms that work in real time. But I stack AIs on top of that to get rid of a lot of the human work. And I will just say with AppSec, we all know we've never had a problem finding vulnerabilities with AppSec tools. That was never the problem. The problem is how do you build this into your process to make sure less of those vulnerabilities get into the code and more of them get remediated? I think there's a ton of smart people out there who've already been looking at how do you really provide the goodness of LLMs on top of AppSec. And you get people like Arshan at Pixie, who has understood the core of how you do AppSec for years and has been building amazing solutions for how do you stack LLM technology on top of that. So I think the idea that there's a free skill pack for Claude, it's not going to put all the lawyers out of business immediately. It's not going to put the AppSec teams out of business immediately. But if I was on an AppSec team or a lawyer, I would be downloading those, really understanding how they could supplement what I do. Because if I don't get it, somebody else is going to be better at doing my job.
Sure. Embrace change. Steve, is there anything I didn't ask you that you want to say?
No, I don't think so. I've really enjoyed being on. If anybody wants to talk further about this stuff, go find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Steve Wilson Exabeam, connect up with me there. Love to hear you and continue to share what I'm working on and my thoughts.
And go get a copy of Steve's book and read that too. It will be very educational. We'll link to it in the blog post that we do with this. But Steve, I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us on Conversing Labs and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks a lot. See you, Paul.